Hi history lovers, and welcome back to the channel where I bring you new videos every week looking at all aspects of the past. Today on History Calling, we are going to look at two interconnected questions. Were Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII really married, and by extension was their daughter Elizabeth I illegitimate? Thanks to the messy ways in which this controversial royal marriage began and ended, and the actions of Henry and all three of his surviving children in the years afterwards, the issue of whether Anne was a mistress or a wife is still very much open to debate, as is her daughter's status as a true-born princess of England or an illegitimate Boleyn. I'll tell you all the reasons why the marriage might or might not have been valid, and if you stay till the end, I'll give you my personal take on the topic, which I'm sure some of you will disagree with, but we can have a good discussion about it later in the comments. Before we get to that though, I'm very excited to announce that this video is sponsored by the lovely people over at History Hit. History Hit is like Netflix, but all history. It brings you the stories that have shaped our world through an award-winning podcast network and an online history channel. They have literally hundreds of programs, over 1,000 podcast episodes, and 5,000 history-related travel articles, and they launch 15 new podcast episodes and 2 new programs every week. Whilst Dan Snow's History Hit continues to be the world's leading history podcast, they also have 4 podcasts covering the Ancients, Warfare, Gone Medieval, and Not Just the Tudors, which is hosted by Susanna Lipscomb. In addition to all this, there is also Patented, Betwixt the Sheets, and American History Hit. One of their programs, which I've watched recently, was hosted by Professor Lipscomb and is called Becoming Anne Boleyn. This documentary focuses on Anne's life before she began her relationship with Henry VIII, which is a part of this famous queen's history which I think is often and unfortunately overlooked. Professor Lipscomb visits Anne's childhood home of Hever Castle and discusses Anne's education, her relationship with her siblings, and her time at the court of Margaret of Austria and as a lady-in-waiting to her future sister-in-law, Mary Tudor, Queen of France, and Queen Claude of France. The documentary is also a treat for anyone interested in Anne's surviving possessions, as it showcases 2 books she owned and inscribed and discusses new research into one of them. If you'd like to watch this, as well as History Hit's huge array of other programs for yourself, click the link in the description box below, which will take you to their subscribe page. You can also get a whopping 50% off your next 3 months when you use the code HISTORYCALLING at checkout. Once again, thank you to History Hit for sponsoring this video, and now let's hear more about the marriage between Anne and Henry. We begin with the basic timeline of Henry and Anne's relationship. They first became a couple in 1526 or 1527, but due to reasons we'll come to in due course, it was early 1533 before they could announce that they were married. Anne was crowned queen that June and gave birth to their daughter Elizabeth on the 7th of September. But less than 3 years later, Henry had her arrested on charges of treason, adultery and incest and executed at the Tower of London on the 19th of May 1536. At the same time, he had their marriage annulled and declared Elizabeth illegitimate, removing her from the line of succession to the English throne. He probably thought that was that, and Elizabeth's days as a potential Queen of England were done and dusted. But things were never that simple in the Tudor royal family, and the issue of what Anne's status had been and what her child's was and would become remained muddy both then and now. When considering whether or not the Boleyn marriage was valid, it is necessary to establish whether the king and his mistress, as Anne was at the time, were even free to wed each other. At first glance, it would certainly seem that Henry was not. He had been married to the Spanish princess, Catherine of Aragon, since 1509, and she was still very much alive in 1533. They had one surviving child, Princess Mary, born in 1516, but Henry was desperate for a male heir to secure the succession. Catherine was past childbearing by the mid-1520s, however, and when he fell in love with her lady-in-waiting, the much younger Anne Boleyn, he began to seek an annulment of his first marriage, claiming that it was unlawful because Catherine was the widow of his brother, Prince Arthur Tudor. Under church law at the time, this would indeed have been an impediment to their marriage. However, Henry and Catherine had been granted a papal dispensation from Pope Julius II to wed, and the king had to argue that Julius had not been empowered to do so because it broke rules laid down in the Bible. This argument was weakened by several factors, however. For one thing, Catherine maintained that she and Arthur never consummated the union, meaning it wasn't fully valid. This is a topic which I already have a video on, by the way, which I'll leave linked for you. For another, although the Bible does indeed say that a man shouldn't sleep with his brother's wife, it specifically decrees that he should marry his brother's widow. Henry and the man who was pope between the 1520s and early 1530s, Clement VII, were at an impasse, and Catherine's nephew, Charles V of Spain, did all he could to frustrate Henry's efforts to abandon her. In the end, the English king had to break from the church in Rome and have his Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declare the Aragon marriage void. That was only done in May 1533, however, after the marriage to Anne had already taken place. Now, Henry's argument was that he'd never been legally married in the first place, and so was free to say "I do" to the Marchioness of Pembroke, which was the title he had given Anne in 1532. But whether that was really true is a matter of interpretation, and in fact the Pope eventually declared in March 1534 that his first marriage was perfectly legal, and that he was in a state of bigamy with Anne. By that point it was too late to do anything, however. The Act of Supremacy passed by the English Parliament that same year established Henry as head of the Church of England, and as for his marital arrangements, well, he'd made his bed, and for the next 3 years Anne would lie in it. So was the king a free man? Well, according to the laws and rulings of the Catholic Church, no. However, by the laws of England in 1533, which were conveniently orchestrated by him, he made sure that he was, by having the first marriage declared void and the second legitimate. Of course, it was incredibly messy to embark on a second union before the previous one had been nullified, but that's Henry for you. You and I may not think he had a valid reason to leave Catherine, and certainly by modern standards in the UK he didn't have grounds for an annulment, but Henry was able to make his own rules, and as such, if he said he was single, then he was, at least in his own realm. I know this is a slightly awkward concept to grasp, so if it helps, try thinking of it like this. In the UK today, no marriage made by a person under the age of 16 is valid, no matter what, but in other countries, such child marriages are valid. And when it comes down to it, what matters is the current law of the country you're in. Admittedly, other European courts, most notably the Spaniards, refused to recognise the second marriage. However, that didn't change the fact that it was legal under English law, making Elizabeth legitimately born. There was also another problem on Henry's end. He'd already slept with Anne's sister, Mary Boleyn. Just like marrying his brother's widow required a dispensation, so too did marrying the sister of one of his ex-lovers. But this was one area in which Rome had obliged him, for Pope Clement VII had already issued such a dispensation before Henry split from that church. So it looks as though Henry was legally able to marry Anne, but was she able to marry him? She had previously been courted by a man named Lord Henry Percy, who later became the Earl of Northumberland in 1527, and there were rumblings even before her fall that the two had been pre-contracted to marry. If true, this would have meant that Anne was not free to wed the king. However, both she and Percy steadfastly maintained that they had never been engaged, and there's no evidence that they were lying. I therefore conclude that Anne was indeed single at the time she wed Henry. This brings us on nicely to the question of when the royal marriage occurred. The ceremony was held in secret, so there's no definitive proof of when it took place, but the traditional date given is the 25th of January 1533, when Anne was about 2.5 months pregnant with Elizabeth. The chronicler Edward Hall, however, claimed that there was an earlier ceremony on the 14th of November 1532. This would place the wedding before the conception, but would that affect Elizabeth's legitimacy? The short answer is no. Children were and are legitimate under English law if born while their parents are married. They don't need to have been conceived in wedlock. Anne would later suffer a miscarriage in January 1536, soon after the death of Catherine of Aragon, at which point she commented that it was for the best because now, if she conceived another child, its legitimacy would not be in doubt. However, that was just her trying to make the best of a bad situation. Had the boy she lost at that point gone on to be born alive, the fact that he was conceived while Catherine still lived would have been neither here nor there. So we've seen that Henry ensured that the Boleyn marriage was valid under English law between 1533 and 1536. Now let's look at what happened in the latter year when he completely reversed his position and said that actually it had been invalid the whole time. The marriage was formally annulled on the 17th of May 1536, just 2 days before Anne's death, though as the relevant paperwork has been lost, we don't know the grounds on which it was voided. From letters written by the likes of Henry Percy and the Imperial Ambassador Eustace Chapuis, though, it seems as though a few reasons were being considered, including the possibility of a pre-contract between Anne and Percy, Henry's prior relationship with Mary Boleyn, and questions over Elizabeth's paternity. According to Anne's biographer, Eric Ives, whose book is linked below for you, the relationship with Mary appears to be the excuse that stuck. Though the Catholic Church had issued a dispensation for it, according to laws passed in England by Henry in 1534, no dispensation was valid if it contravened God's laws. By arguing that his second marriage did just that, Henry could have said that the papal dispensation to marry Anne was invalid, and so the marriage was too. This annulment was, of course, schizoid, to use David Starkey's word, as Anne could hardly have committed adultery against Henry if she had never been married to him in the first place, and there was really no need to annul the marriage at all, given that she was soon to be dead. But the king was a man who liked to have his cake and eat it. As for Elizabeth's paternity, although imperial sources loyal to Catherine and Mary put about rumours that the toddler was the daughter of her mother's brother, and her sister Mary would later say that she thought Elizabeth looked like Mark Smeaton, one of the men accused of adultery with the Queen, Henry never seems to have doubted that she was his child, and she certainly resembled him physically, especially in her pale skin and red hair. I therefore think it's safe to ignore these slanderous rumours. Without knowing for sure what the reason or reasons for the annulment were, it's hard to comment on whether it was valid or not. But assuming that the issue was the relationship with Mary Boleyn, again, the king was pretty much able to make and even interpret English law in whatever way he chose, so that as bonkers as it may seem to us, it was legal under the laws of England at the time, even though this wouldn't be grounds for an annulment or divorce today. Of course, a simpler way to get out of the marriage would have been to say that Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon all along, and that was the reason the Boleyn marriage couldn't stand. But he apparently didn't want to admit to being wrong about that, nor did he want to re-legitimise his elder daughter Mary, who, like her mother, had fought the dissolution of the Aragon marriage every step of the way, greatly angering her father in the process. So basically, the end of the Boleyn marriage was just as complicated as its beginning, and I'd be interested to hear in the comments what you make of Henry's second annulment. Now let's focus a little more heavily on Elizabeth. She'd been born the heiress to the throne, according to the laws in force in England between 1533 and May 1536, but thanks to her mother's fall, she was technically nothing more than an illegitimate Boleyn, though she never used that surname, and as we've seen, Henry always acknowledged her as his biological child with the title of the Lady Elizabeth. Neither she nor her sister, the Lady Mary, had any claim on the throne anymore, and the situation remained that way until the Parliament of 1543. By that point, Henry finally had a legitimate son, the future Edward VI, born in 1537, but it seemed unlikely he would ever have any more children, and he now had MPs pass a new Act of Succession, which actually went through in 1544, and which placed both Mary and Elizabeth back in line for the throne after Edward and any children he had. It didn't re-legitimise either daughter, however, or acknowledge that the marriages to Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn had been valid. So Elizabeth's position as regards the throne had improved, but she was still illegitimate, and legally speaking, she would always stay that way, though as we'll see, people didn't always act as though she was. Two people who did treat her as illegitimate once they were on the throne were her brother and sister. Henry died in 1547, and 6 years later, the 15-year-old Edward was on his deathbed too. Horrified at the prospect of his Catholic sister Mary taking the throne, however, he attempted to overturn the 1543 Act of Succession and leave the throne to his cousin, the 15-year-old Lady Jane Grey, who was an ardent Protestant like him. His reasoning for skipping Mary and the Protestant Elizabeth II was that they were illegitimate, which must have been a real slap in the face to both women, as Mary considered herself perfectly legitimate, even though her father had made her say otherwise, and Elizabeth had always got along well with her little brother, only to be slighted by him at the last minute. Edward's attempt to circumvent Mary failed, of course. If you watch the video on her life, which I'll leave linked in the description box for you, you can hear all about how she dealt with the attempt to supplant her with Jane. But it shows that the stigma attached to Elizabeth's birth was still very much present. I'd like to think her brother never made a point of calling her illegitimate to her face, but it was evidently what he thought of her privately, and he didn't think she deserved to ever hold the throne, no matter what their father's wishes had been. In many ways, Mary was of a similar mind. We've already seen that she questioned her sister's paternity, but she didn't stop there. For when she came to the throne, her first parliament declared her parents' marriage valid and herself legitimate. This, by extension, reinforced the idea that the Boleyn marriage was bigamous and Elizabeth illegitimate. Yet in the end, Mary had more respect for the 1543 Act of Succession and her father's wishes than might be expected, and certainly more than Edward did. In the final codicil made to her will, she acknowledged that Elizabeth was her successor, even though she couldn't bring herself to mention her sister by name. And when she died in November 1558, the throne passed peacefully to Anne Boleyn's daughter. See my video on Mary's will to learn more about that document and what it tells us about her attitude towards Elizabeth. But what did Elizabeth have to say about her birth status? Well, not much, at least not directly. She never had the annulment of her parents' marriage and her delegitimization formally overturned. Yet she did, in subtle ways, emphasize that she was a true-born princess and later Queen of England. At an official pageant staged for her coronation, for instance, life-sized effigies of both her parents were included, and Anne was shown wearing a crown and holding a sceptre, emphasizing her status as a crowned Queen of England and the wife of Henry VIII. Elizabeth also had an Act of Parliament passed soon after she came to the throne, which made her Anne's legal heiress, and in which Anne is very specifically referred to as the late Queen, again reinforcing her position as Henry's wife. Despite her coronation, had she not truly been married to him, she wouldn't have been a queen, for a coronation does not make a monarch or a consort. During Henry VII's reign, for instance, one of the pretenders to the throne, Lambert Simnel, was crowned king in Dublin, though clearly he wasn't the monarch. In addition, sovereigns and consorts such as Edward VIII and the later four wives of Henry VIII, none of whom were ever crowned, still held the title of king or queen. So where does this leave us? Well, in a bit of a quandary, because you can make a convincing argument both for and against the validity of the Boleyn marriage, and by extension, Elizabeth I's legitimacy. I did promise you, however, that I would give you my personal take on the situation, so here goes. According to the laws in force in England at the time, the Boleyn marriage was valid until it wasn't, and Elizabeth I was born legitimate, but lost that status at the age of 2 and never regained it. She therefore spent most of her life legally illegitimate, and on numerous occasions that is how her father, brother, sister, her cousin Mary Queen of Scots, who claimed to be the real Queen of England, the English Parliament and foreign powers, especially the Papacy and the Spaniards, treated her. Even she never overtly declared her parents' marriage valid and herself legitimately born. My conclusion, therefore, is that the Boleyn marriage wasn't legitimate after 1536, and nor was its offspring. That said, there was enough doubt over the matter, and Henry had created enough legal loopholes with the 1543 Act of Succession that Elizabeth was able to take the throne unchallenged in 1558, despite her questionable birth status, a feat which is extremely unusual in English history. I would also like to point out that just because I think that the marriage was ultimately legally invalid, that doesn't mean that Anne didn't believe in the soundness of it. On the contrary, I think she did view herself as Henry's true wife and queen. In addition, Henry's own determination to have her killed makes me think that annulment or not, he wondered if it might be legitimate too, and wanted to make sure he had no wives living before he became betrothed to, let alone wed and had children with, Jane Seymour. Sometimes, in my more generous moments, I even have a shred of sympathy for him, as had he lived a few centuries later, he could have obtained an actual divorce from Catherine and not been forced to stay in a marriage against his will for 7 years. Of course, we're talking about a guy who got out of 2 of his later marriages by having his wives judicially murdered, so my sympathy for him never lasts long. As for Elizabeth's views on the matter, who knows? The few references we have from her regarding her mother suggest that she believed the marriage was a true one, but she could hardly have said anything else. To do so would have called into question her right to the throne, for despite the fact that that right actually rested on the aforementioned Succession Act, it was still highly advantageous to have at least some claim to legitimacy. What do you think, though? Do you view the Boleyn marriage as valid, and why? Let me know in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please remember to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so that YouTube lets you know every time I upload. I'd also like to thank my wonderful patrons, whose generous support helps me to keep making these videos for you, and if you'd like to consider joining them and getting some history calling perks, see the link to my Patreon account in the description box below. Thank you too to those of you who give me one-off donations using the thanks button below the videos. This is also much appreciated. As always though, everyone please remember that there is no pressure to support in any of these ways. I'm delighted just to have you here as viewers. That's all for now, but if you'd like to learn more about the Tudors, try one of these options next. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.